Hello there, and welcome to this reading of Eclipse with relaxing rain sounds in the background to help you get down to sleep. Tonight I have a very special offer for you if you are tired of waiting for the next episode and you've been wanting to join the Patreon to get access to all of my audiobooks in full and get 2 new readings every week. Well, this week, because of the Black Friday sales and because it's almost Christmas time, you can get 50% off of your first month on me. This is available for this week only if you sign up at patreon.com/downtosleep and use the code word Twilight. That takes Patreon down to something like $2 or $3 a month. You get access to over 400 readings that I've done and the entire audiobook for Eclipse, New Moon, Twilight, and we're about to finish Bree Tanner and start Breaking Dawn. So there's never been a better time to jump on over to the Patreon. It is the best place to listen. If you're just enjoying the free episodes here on YouTube, of course, please do like and subscribe to get more. I'll be finishing this book here, and please leave me a comment to help support the channel. You can also get even more free readings over on the main channel at youtube.com/downtosleep and on Spotify and everywhere you get podcasts. But for now, let's go ahead and tuck you in. Take a nice deep breath for me, and let's get down to sleep. Good night. To no one's surprise, Charlie had no problem at all with me going to La Push for a bonfire. Jacob crowed with undisguised exultation when I called to give him the news, and he seemed eager enough to embrace Edward's safety measures. He promised to meet us at the line between territories at 6. I had decided, after a short internal debate, that I would not sell my motorcycle. I would take it back to La Push where it belonged, and when I no longer needed it anymore, well, I would insist Jacob profit from his work somehow. He could sell it or give it to a friend. It didn't matter to me. Tonight seemed like a good opportunity to return the bike to Jacob's garage. As gloomy as I was feeling about things lately, every day seemed like a possible last chance. I didn't have time to procrastinate any task, no matter how minor. Edward only nodded when I explained what I wanted, but I thought I saw a flicker of consternation in his eyes, and I knew he was no happier about the idea of me on a motorcycle than Charlie was. I followed him back to his house, to the garage where I'd left the bike. It wasn't until I pulled the truck in and got out that I realized the consternation might not be entirely about my safety this time. Next to my little antique motorcycle, overshadowing it, was another vehicle. To call this other vehicle a motorcycle hardly seemed fair, since it didn't seem to belong to the same family as my suddenly shabby-looking bike. It was big, and sleek, and silver, and even totally motionless, it looked fast. "What is that?" "Nothing," Edward murmured. "Doesn't look like nothing." Edward's expression was casual. He seemed determined to blow it off. "Well, I didn't know if you were going to forgive your friend, or he you, and I wondered if you would still want to ride your bike anyway. It sounded like something that you enjoyed. I thought I could go with you, if you wished." He shrugged. I stared at that beautiful machine. Beside it, my bike looked like a broken tricycle. I felt a sudden wave of sadness when I realized that this was not a bad analogy for the way I probably looked next to Edward. "I wouldn't be able to keep up with you," I whispered. Edward put his hand under my chin and pulled my face around so he could see it straight on. With one finger, he tried to push the corner of my mouth up. "I'd keep pace with you, Bella." "That wouldn't be much fun for you." "Of course it would, if we were together." I bit my lip and imagined it for a moment. "Edward, if you thought I was going too fast or losing control of the bike or something, what would you do?" He hesitated, obviously trying to find the right answer. I knew the truth. He'd find some way to save me before I crashed. Then he smiled. It looked effortless, except for the tiny defensive tightening of his eyes. "This is something you do with Jacob. I see that now. It's just that, well, I don't slow him down so much, you know? I could try, I guess. I eyed the silver motorcycle doubtfully. "Don't worry about it," Edward said, and then he laughed lightly. I saw Jasper admiring it. Perhaps it's time he discovered a new way to travel. After all, Alice has her Porsche now. "Edward, He interrupted me with a quick kiss. I said not to worry. "But would you do something for me?" "Whatever you need," I promised quickly. He dropped my face and leaned over the far side of the big motorcycle, retrieving something he had stashed there. He came back with one object that was black and shapeless, and another that was red and easily identifiable. "Please," he asked, flashing the crooked smile that always destroyed my resistance. I took the red helmet, weighing it in my hands. "I'll look stupid." "No, you'll look smart. Smart enough not to get yourself hurt." He threw the black thing, whatever it was, over his arm, and then took my face in his hands. There are things between my hands right now that I can't live without. You could take care of them. "Okay, fine. What's that other thing?" I asked suspiciously. He laughed and shook out some kind of padded jacket. "It's a riding jacket. I hear road rash is quite uncomfortable. Not that I would know myself." He held it out for me. With a deep sigh, I flipped my hair back and stuffed the helmet on my head. I shoved my arms through the sleeves of the jacket. He zipped me in, a smile playing around the corners of his lips, and took a step back. I felt bulky. "Be honest, how hideous do I look?" He took another step back and pursed his lips. "That bad, huh?" No, Bella, actually," he seemed to be struggling for the right word. "You look sexy." I laughed out loud. "Right. Very sexy, really. You're just saying that so I'll wear it. But that's okay, you're right, it's smarter." He wrapped his arms around me and pulled me against his chest. "You're silly. I suppose that's part of your charm. Though I'll admit it, this helmet does have its drawbacks." And then he pulled the helmet off so that he could kiss me. As Edward drove me toward La Push a little while later, I realized that this unprecedented situation felt oddly familiar. It took me a moment of thought to pinpoint the source of the déjà vu. "You know what this reminds me of?" I asked. "It's just like when I was a kid and Renee would pass me off to Charlie for the summer. I feel like a 7-year-old. Edward laughed. I didn't mention it out loud, but the biggest difference between the two circumstances was that Renee and Charlie had been on better terms. About halfway to La Push, we rounded the corner and found Jacob leaning against the side of the red Volkswagen he had built for himself out of scraps. Jacob's carefully neutral expression dissolved into a smile when I waved from the front seat. Edward parked the Volvo 30 yards away. "Call me whenever you're ready to come home," he said, "and I'll be here." "I won't be out late, I promised." Edward pulled the bike and my new gear out of the trunk of his car. I'd been quite impressed that it had all fit. But it wasn't so hard to manage when you were strong enough to juggle full-sized vans, let alone small motorcycles. Jacob watched, making no move to approach, his smile gone and his dark eyes indecipherable. I tucked the helmet under my arm and threw the jacket across the seat. "Do you have it all?" Edward asked. "No problem," I assured him. He sighed and leaned toward me. I turned my face up for a goodbye peck, but Edward took me by surprise, fastening his arms tightly around me and kissing me with as much enthusiasm as he had in the garage. Before long, I was gasping for air. Edward laughed quietly at something, and then let me go. "Goodbye," he said. "I really do like the jacket." As I turned away from him, my thought I saw a flash of something in his eyes that I wasn't supposed to see. I couldn't tell for sure what it was exactly. Worry, maybe. For a second I thought it was panic, but I was probably just making something out of nothing, as usual. I could feel his eyes on my back as I pushed my bike toward the invisible vampire-werewolf treaty line to meet Jacob. "What's all that?" Jacob called to me, his voice wary, scrutinizing the motorcycle with an enigmatic expression. "I thought I should put this back where it belongs," I told him. He pondered that for one short second, and then his wide smile stretched across his face. I knew the exact point that I was in werewolf territory because Jacob shoved away from his car and loped quickly over to me, closing the distance in 3 long strides. He took the bike from me, balanced it on the kickstand, and grabbed me up in another vice-tight hug. I heard the Volvo's engine growl, and I struggled to get free. "Cut it out, Jake," I gasped breathlessly. He laughed and set me down. I turned to wave goodbye, but the silver car was already disappearing around the curve in the road. "Nice," I commented, allowing some acid to leak into my voice. His eyes widened in false innocence. "What?" "He's being pretty dang pleasant about this. You don't need to push your luck." He laughed again, louder than before. He found what I'd said very funny indeed. I tried to see the joke as he walked around the rabbit to hold my door open for me. "Bella," he finally said, still chuckling as he shut the door behind me. "You can't push what you don't have." "Are you going to eat that hot dog?" Paul asked Jacob, his eyes locked on the last remnant of the huge meal the werewolves had consumed. Jacob leaned back against my knees and toyed with the hot dog he had spitted on a straightened wire hanger. The flames at the edge of the bonfire licked along its blistered skin. He heaved a sigh and patted his stomach. It was somehow still flat, though I'd lost count of how many hot dogs he'd eaten after his 10th. Not to mention the supersized bag of chips or the 2-liter bottle of root beer. "I guess," Jake said slowly. "I'm so full I'm about to puke, but I think I can force it down. I won't enjoy it all, though." He sighed again sadly. Despite the fact that Paul had eaten at least as much as Jacob, he glowered and his hands balled up into fists. "Sheesh," Jacob laughed. "Kidding, Paul. Here." He flipped the homemade skewer across the circle. I expected it to land hot dog first in the sand, but Paul caught it neatly on the right end without difficulty. Hanging out with no one but extremely dexterous people all the time was going to give me a complex. "Thanks, man," Paul said, already over his brief fit of temper. The fire crackled, settling lower toward the sand. Sparks blew up in a sudden puff of brilliant orange against the black sky. Funny, I hadn't noticed that the sun had set. For the first time, I wondered how late it had gotten. I'd lost track of time completely. It was easier being with my Quileute friends than I'd expected. While Jacob and I had dropped off my bike at the garage, and he had admitted ruefully that the helmet was a good idea, that he should have thought of himself, I'd started to worry about showing up with him at the bonfire, wondering if the werewolves would consider me a traitor now. Would they be angry with Jacob for inviting me? Would I ruin the party? But when Jacob had towed me out of the forest to the cliff-top meeting place, where the fire already roared brighter than the cloud-obscured sun, it had all been very casual and light. "Hey, vampire girl," Embry had greeted me loudly. Quill had jumped up to give me a high five and kiss me on the cheek. Emily had squeezed my hand when we'd sat on the cool stone ground beside her and Sam. Other than a few teasing complaints, mostly by Paul about keeping the bloodsucker stench downwind, I was treated like someone who belonged. It wasn't just kids in attendance either. Billy was here, his wheelchair stationed at what seemed the natural head of the circle. Beside him, on a folding lawn chair, looking quite brittle, was Quill's ancient, white-haired grandfather, Old Quill. Sue Clearwater, widow of Charlie's friend Harry, had a chair on the other side. Her two children, Leah and Seth, were also there, sitting on the ground like the rest of us. This surprised me, but all three were clearly in on the secret now. From the way Billy and Old Quill spoke to Sue, it sounded to me like she'd taken Harry's place on the council. Did that make her children automatic members of the Push's most secret society? I wondered how horrible it was for Leah to sit across the circle from Sam and Emily. Her lovely face betrayed no emotion, but she never looked away from the flames. Looking at the perfection of Leah's features, I couldn't help but compare them to Emily's ruined face. What did Leah think of Emily's scars, now she knew the truth behind them? Did it seem like justice in her eyes? Little Seth Clearwater wasn't so little anymore. With his huge, happy grin and his long, gangly build, he reminded me very much of a younger Jacob. The resemblance made me smile, and then sigh. Was Seth doomed to have his life change as drastically as the rest of these boys? Was that future where he and his family were allowed to be here? The whole pack was there. Sam with his Emily, Paul, Embry, Quill, and Jared with Kim, the girl he'd imprinted upon. My first impression of Kim was that she was a nice girl, a little shy and a little plain. She had a wide face, mostly cheekbones, with eyes too small to balance them out. Her nose and mouth were both too broad for traditional beauty. Her flat black hair was thin and wispy in the wind, that never seemed to let up atop the cliff. That was my first impression, but after a few hours of watching Jared watch Kim, I could no longer find anything plain about the girl. The way he stared at her. It was like a blind man seeing the sun for the first time. Like a collector finding an undiscovered Da Vinci. Like a mother looking into the face of her newborn child. His wondering eyes made me see new things about her. How her skin looked like russet-colored silk in the firelight. How the shape of her lips was a perfect double curve. How white her teeth were against them. How long her eyelashes were, brushing her cheek when she looked down. Kim's skin sometimes darkened when she met Jared's awed gaze, and her eyes would drop as if in embarrassment, but she had a hard time keeping her eyes away from his for any length of time. Watching them, I felt like I better understood what Jacob had told me about imprinting before. It's hard to resist that level of commitment and adoration. Kim was nodding off now against Jared's chest, his arms around her. I imagined she would be very warm there. "It's getting late," I murmured to Jacob. "Don't start that yet," Jacob whispered back, though certainly half the group here had hearing sensitive enough to hear us anyway. "The best part's coming." "What's the best part? You swallowing an entire cow whole?" Jacob chuckled his low, throaty laugh. "No, that's the finale. We didn't meet just to eat through a week's worth of food. This is technically a council meeting. It's Quill's first time, and he hasn't heard the stories yet. Well, he's heard them, but this will be the first time he knows they're true. That tends to make a guy pay closer attention. Kim and Seth and Leah are all first-timers too." "Stories?" Jacob scooted back beside me, where I rested against a low ridge of rock. He put his arm over my shoulder and spoke even lower into my ear. "The histories we always thought were legends," he said. "The stories of how we came to be. The first is the story of the spirit warriors." It was almost as if Jacob's soft whisper was the introduction. The atmosphere changed abruptly around the low burning fire. Paul and Embry sat up straighter. Jared nudged Kim and then pulled her gently upright. Emily produced a spiral-bound notebook and a pen, looking exactly like a student set for an important lecture. Sam twisted just slightly beside her so that he was facing the same direction as old Quill, who was on his other side. Suddenly I realized the elders of the council here were not 3, but 4 in number. Leah Clearwater, her face still a beautiful and emotionless mask, closed her eyes. Not like she was tired, but as if to help her concentration. Her brother leaned in toward the elders eagerly. The fire crackled, sending another explosion of sparks glittering up against the night. Billy cleared his throat, and with no more introduction than his son's whisper, began telling the story in his rich, deep voice. The words poured out with precision, as if he knew them by heart, but also with feeling and a subtle rhythm, like poetry performed by its author. The Quiutes have been a small people from the beginning, Billy said. We are a small people still, but we have never disappeared. This is because there's always been magic in our blood. It wasn't always the magic of shape-shifting. That came later. First, we were spirit warriors. Never before had I recognized the ring of majesty that was in Billy Black's voice, though I realize now that this authority had always been there. Emily's pen sprinted across the sheets of paper as she tried to keep up with him. In the beginning, the tribe settled in this harbor and became skilled shipbuilders and fishermen, but the tribe was small, and the harbor was rich in fish. There were others who coveted our land, and we were too small to hold it. A larger tribe moved against us, and we took to our ships to escape them. Kahilaha was not the first spirit warrior, but we do not remember the stories that came before his. We do not remember who was the first to discover this power, or how it had been used before this crisis. Kahilaha was the first spirit chief in our history. In this emergency, Kahilaha used the magic to defend our land. He and all his warriors left the ship, not their bodies, but their spirits. Their women watched over their bodies in the waves, and the men took their spirits back to our harbor. They could not physically touch the enemy tribe, but they had other ways. The stories tell us they could blow fierce winds into their enemies' camps. They could make a great screaming in the wind that terrified their foes. The stories also tell us that the animals could see the spirit warriors and understand them. The animals would do their bidding. Kahilaha took his spirit army and wreaked havoc on the intruders. This invading tribe had packs of big, thick-furred dogs that they used to pull their sleds in the frozen north. The spirit warriors turned the dogs against their masters, and then brought a mighty infestation of bats up from the cliff caverns. They used the screaming wind to aid the dogs in confusing the men. The dogs and bats won. The survivors scattered, calling our harbor a cursed place. The dogs ran wild when the spirit warriors released them. The Quileutes returned to their bodies, and their wives victorious. The other nearby tribes, the Hos and the Makas, made treaties with the Quileutes. They wanted nothing to do with our magic. We lived in peace with them. When an enemy came against us, the spirit warriors would drive them off. Generations passed. Then came the last great spirit chief, Taha Aki. He was known for his wisdom and for being a man of peace. The people lived well and content in his care. But there was one man, Udlapa, who was not content. A low hiss ran around the fire. I was too slow to see where it came from. Billy ignored it and went on with the legend. Utlapa was one of Chief Taha Aki's strongest spirit warriors. A powerful man, but a grasping man too. He thought the people should use their magic to expand their lands, to enslave the Hos and the Makas and build an empire. Now, when the warriors were their spirit selves, they knew each other's thoughts. Taha Aki saw what Utlapa dreamed, and was angry with Utlapa. Utlapa was commanded to leave the people and never use his spirit self again. Utlapa was a strong man, but the chief's warriors outnumbered him. He had no choice but to leave. The furious outcast hid in the forest nearby, waiting for a chance to get revenge against the chief. Even in times of peace, the spirit chief was vigilant in protecting his people. Often he would go to a sacred secret place in the mountains. He would leave his body behind and sweep down through the forests and along the coast, making sure no threat approached. One day, when Taha Aki left to perform this duty, Utlapa followed. At first, Utlapa simply planned to kill the chief, but this plan had its drawbacks. Surely the spirit warriors would seek to destroy him, and they could follow faster than he could escape. As he hid in the rocks and watched the chief prepare to leave his body, another plan occurred to him. Taha Aki left his body in the secret place and flew with the winds to keep watch over his people. Utlapa waited until he was sure the chief had traveled some distance with his spirit self. Taha Aki knew it the instant that Utlapa had joined him in the spirit world, and he also knew Utlapa's murderous plan. He raced back to his secret place, but even the winds weren't fast enough to save him. When he returned, his body was already gone. Utlapa's body lay abandoned, but Utlapa had not left Taha Aki with an escape. He had cut his own body's throat with Taha Aki's hands. Taha Aki followed his body down the mountain. He screamed at Utlapa, but Utlapa ignored him as if he were mere wind. Taha Aki watched with despair as Utlapa took his place as chief of the Kulids. For a few weeks, Utlapa did nothing but make sure that everyone believed he was Taha Aki. Then the changes began. Utlapa's first edict was to forbid any warrior to enter the spirit world. He claimed he'd had a vision of danger, but really he was afraid. He knew Taha Aki would be waiting for the chance to tell his story. Utlapa was also afraid to enter the spirit world himself, knowing Taha Aki would quickly claim his body. So his dreams of conquest with a spirit warrior army were impossible, and he sought to content himself with ruling over the tribe. He became a burden, seeking privileges that Taha Aki had never requested, refusing to work alongside his warriors, taking a young second wife and then a third, though Taha Aki's wife lived on, something unheard of in the tribe. Taha Aki watched in helpless fury. Eventually, Taha Aki tried to kill his body to save the tribe from Utlapa's excesses. He brought a fierce wolf down from the mountains, but Utlapa hid behind his warriors. When the wolf killed a young man who was protecting the false chief, Taha Aki felt horrible grief. He ordered the wolf away. All the stories tell us it was no easy thing to be a spirit warrior. It was more frightening than exhilarating to be freed from one's body. This is why they only used their magic in times of need. The chief's solitary journeys to keep watch were a burden and a sacrifice. Being bodiless was disorienting, uncomfortable, horrifying. Taha Aki had been away from his body for so long at this point that he was in agony. He felt he was doomed. never to cross over to the final land where his ancestors waited, stuck in this torturous nothingness forever. The great wolf followed Tahaki's spirit as he twisted and writhed in agony through the woods. The wolf was very large for its kind, and beautiful. Tahaki was suddenly jealous of the dumb animal. At least it had a body. At least it had a life. Even life as an animal would be better than this horrible, empty consciousness. And then, Tahaki had the idea that changed us all. He asked the great wolf to make room for him, to share. The wolf complied. Tahaki entered the wolf's body with relief and gratitude. It was not his human body, but it was better than the void of the spirit world. As one, the man and the wolf returned to the village on the harbor. The people ran in fear, shouting for the warriors to come. The warriors ran to meet the wolf with their spears. Uthapa, of course, stayed safely hidden. Tahaki did not attack his warriors. He retreated slowly from them, speaking with his eyes and trying to yelp the songs of his people. The warriors began to realize that the wolf was no ordinary animal, that there was a spirit influencing it. One older warrior, a man named Yut, decided to disobey the false chief's order and tried to communicate with the wolf. As soon as Yut crossed to the spirit world, Tahaki left the wolf. The animal waited tamely for his return. Yut gathered the truth in an instant and welcomed his true chief home. At this time, Uthapa came to see if the wolf had been defeated. When he saw Yut lying lifelessly on the ground, surrounded by protective warriors, he realized what was happening. He drew his knife and raced forward to kill Yut before he could return to his body. "Traitor," he screamed, and the warriors did not know what to do. The chief had forbidden spirit journeys, and it was the chief's decision how to punish those who disobeyed. Yut jumped back into his body, but Uthapa had his knife at his throat and a hand covering his mouth. Tahaki's body was strong, and Yut was weak with age. Yut could not even say one word to warn the others before Uthapa silenced him forever. Tahaki watched as Yut's spirit slipped away to the final lands that were barred to Tahaki for all eternity. He felt a great rage, more powerful than anything he'd felt before. He entered the big wolf again, meaning to rip Utlapa's throat out. But as he joined the wolf, the greatest magic happened. Tahaki's anger was the anger of a man. The love he had for his people and the hatred he had for their oppressor were too vast for the wolf's body, too human. The wolf shuddered, and before the eyes of the shocked warriors in Uthapa, transformed into a man. The new man did not look like Tahaki's body. He was far more glorious. He was the flesh interpretation of Tahaki's spirit. The warriors recognized him at once, for they had flown with Tahaki's spirit. Uthapa tried to run, but Tahaki had the strength of the wolf in his new body. He caught the thief and crushed the spirit from him before he could jump out the stolen body. The people rejoiced when they understood what had happened. Tahaki quickly set everything right, working again with his people and giving the young wives back to their families. The only change he kept in place was the end of the spirit travels. He knew that it was too dangerous now that the idea of stealing a life was there. The spirit warriors were no more. From that point on, Tahaki was more than either wolf or man. They called him Tahaki, the Great Wolf, or Tahaki, the Spirit Man. He led the tribe for many, many years, for he did not age. When danger threatened, he would resume his wolf self to fight or frighten the enemy. The people dwelt in peace. Tahaki fathered many sons, and some of these found that after they had reached the age of manhood, they too could transform into wolves. The wolves were all different, because they were spirit wolves, and reflected the man they were inside. So that's why Sam's all black, Quill muttered under his breath, grinning. Black heart, black fur. I was so involved in the story it was a shock to come back to the present, to the circle around the dying fire. With another shock, I realized that the circle was made up of Tahaki's great, to however many degrees, grandsons. The fire threw a volley of sparks into the sky, and they shivered and danced, making shapes that were almost decipherable. "And your chocolate fur reflects what?" Sam whispered back to Quill. "How sweet you are?" Billy ignored their jibes. Some of the sons became warriors with Tahaki, and they no longer aged. Others, who did not like the transformation, refused to join the pack of wolfmen. These began to age again, and the tribe discovered that the wolfmen could grow old like anyone else if they gave up their spirit wolves. Tahaki had lived the span of 3 old men's lives. He had married a 3rd wife after the deaths of the first 2, and found in her his true spirit wife. Though he had loved the others, this was something else. He decided to give up his spirit wolf, so he would die when she did. That is how the magic came to us. But it is not the end of the story. He looked at old Quillatera, who shifted in his chair, straightening his frail shoulders. Billy took a drink from a bottle of water and wiped his forehead. Emily's pen never hesitated as she scribbled furiously on the paper. That was the story of the spirit warriors, old Quill began in a thin tenor voice. This is the story of the 3rd wife's sacrifice. Many years after Tahaki gave up his spirit wolf, when he was an old man, trouble began in the north with the Makars. Several young women of their tribe had disappeared, and they blamed it on the neighboring wolves who they feared and mistrusted. The wolfmen could still read each other's thoughts while in their wolf forms, just like their ancestors had while in their spirit forms. They knew that none of their number was to blame. Tahaki tried to pacify the Makar chief, but there was too much fear. Tahaki did not want to have a war on his hands. He was no longer a warrior to lead his people. He charged his eldest wolf son, Tahawi, with finding the true culprit before hostilities began. Tahawi led the 5 other wolves in his pack on a search through the mountains, looking for any evidence of missing Makars. They came across something they had never encountered before. A strange, sweet scent in the forest that burned their noses to the point of pain. I shrank a little closer to Jacob's side. I saw the corner of his mouth twitch with humor, and his arm tightened around me. They did not know what creature would leave such a scent, but they followed it, old Quill continued. His quavering voice did not have the majesty of Billy's, but it had a strange, fierce edge of urgency about it. My pulse jumped as his words came faster. They found faint traces of human scent and human blood along the trail. They were sure this was the enemy they were searching for. The journey took them so far north that Tahawi sent half the pack, the younger ones, back to the harbor to report to Tahaki. Tahawi and his 2 brothers did not return. The younger brothers searched for their elders but found only silence. Tahaki mourned for his sons. He wished to avenge his son's death, but he was old. He went to the Makar chief in his mourning clothes and told him everything that had happened. The Makar chief believed his grief, and tensions ended between the tribes. A year later, 2 Makar maidens disappeared from their homes on the same night. The Makars called on the Quileute wolves at once, who found the same sweet stink all through the Makar village. The wolves went on the hunt again. Only one came back. He was Yahota, the oldest son of Tahaki's 3rd wife and the youngest in the pack. He brought something with him that had never been seen in all the days of the Quileutes. A strange, cold, stony corpse that he carried in pieces. All who were of Tahaki's blood, even those who had never been wolves, could smell the piercing smell of the dead creature. This was the enemy of the Makars. Yahauta described what had happened. He and his brothers had found the creature who looked like a man but was hard as granite rock, with the 2 Makar daughters. One girl was already dead, white and bloodless on the ground. The other was in the creature's arms, his mouth at her throat. She may have been alive when they came upon the hideous scene, but the creature quickly snapped her neck and tossed her lifeless body to the ground when they approached. His white lips were covered in her blood, and his eyes glowed red. Yahauta described the fierce strength and speed of the creature. One of his brothers quickly became a victim when he underestimated that strength. The creature ripped him apart like a doll. Yahauta and his older brother were more wary. They worked together, coming at the creature from the sides, outmaneuvering it. They had to reach the very limits of their wolf strength and speed, something that had never been tested before. The creature was hard as stone and cold as ice. They found only their teeth could damage it. They began to rip small pieces of the creature apart while it fought them. But the creature learned quickly, and soon was matching their maneuvers. It got its hands on Yahouta's brother. Yahauta found an opening on the creature's throat and he lunged. His teeth tore the head off the creature, but the hands continued to mangle his brother. Yahauta ripped the creature into unrecognizable chunks, tearing pieces apart in a desperate attempt to save his brother. But he was too late. But in the end, the creature was destroyed. Or so they thought. Yahauta laid the reeking remains out to be examined by the elders. One severed hand lay beside a piece of the creature's granite arm. The 2 pieces touched when the elders poked them with sticks, and the hand reached out towards the arm piece, trying to reassemble itself. Horrified, the elders set fire to the remains. A great cloud of choking, vile smoke polluted the air. When there was nothing but ashes, they separated the ashes into many small bags and spread them far and wide, some in the ocean, some in the forest, some in the cliff caverns. Tahaki wore one bag around his neck so he would be warned if the creature ever tried to put himself together again. Old Quill paused and looked at Billy. Billy pulled out a leather thong from around his neck. Hanging from the end was a small bag, blackened with age. A few people gasped. I might have been one of them. They called it the Cold One, the Blood Drinker, and lived in fear that it was not alone. They only had one wolf protector left, young Yahauta. They did not have long to wait. The creature had a mate, another blood drinker, who came to the Quileutes seeking revenge. The stories say the Cold Woman was the most beautiful thing human eyes had ever seen. She looked like the goddess of the dawn when she entered the village that morning. The sun was shining for once, and it glittered off her white skin and lit the golden hair that flowed down to her knees. Her face was magical in its beauty, her eyes black in her white face. Some fell to their knees to worship her. She asked something in a high, piercing voice in a language no one had ever heard. The people were dumbfounded, not knowing how to answer her. There was none of Tahaki's blood among the witnesses but one small boy. He clung to his mother and screamed that the smell was hurting his nose. One of the elders, on his way to council, heard the boy and realized what had come among them. He yelled for the people to run. She killed him first. There were 20 witnesses to the cold woman's approach. 2 survived, only because she grew distracted by the blood and paused to sate her thirst. They ran to Tahaki, who sat in council with the other elders, his sons and his third wife. Yahauta transformed into his spirit wolf as soon as he heard the news. He went to destroy the blood drinker alone. Tahaki, his third wife, his sons, and his elders followed behind him. At first they could not find the creature, only the evidence of her attack. Bodies lay broken, a few drained of blood, strewn across the road where she'd appeared. Then they heard the screams, and hurried to the harbor. A handful of Eclipse had run to the ship for refuge. She swam after them like a shark and broke the bow of their boat with her incredible strength. When the ship sank, she caught those trying to swim away and broke them too. She saw the great wolf on the shore, and she forgot the fleeing swimmers. She swam so fast she was a blur and came, dripping and glorious, to stand before Yahauta. She pointed at him with one white finger and asked another incomprehensible question. Yahauta waited. It was a close fight, but she was not the warrior her mate had been. But Yahauta was alone. There was no one to distract her fury from him. When Yahauta lost, Tahaki screamed in defiance. He limped forward and shifted into an ancient white-muzzled wolf. The wolf was old, but this was Tahaki the spirit man, and his rage made him strong. The fight began again. Tahaki's third wife had just seen her son die before her. Now her husband fought, and she had no hope that he could win. She'd heard every word the witnesses to the slaughter had told the council. She'd heard the story of Yahauta's first victory, and knew that his brother's diversion had saved him. The third wife grabbed a knife from the belt of one of the sons who stood beside her. They were all young sons, not yet men, and she knew they would die when their father failed. The third wife ran toward the cold woman with the dagger raised high. The cold woman smiled, barely distracted from her fight with the old wolf. She had no fear of the weak human woman, or the knife that would not even scratch her skin. She was about to deliver the death blow to Tahaki. And then, the third wife did something the cold woman did not expect. She fell to her knees at the blood drinker's feet and plunged the knife into her own heart. Blood spurted through the third wife's fingers and splashed against the cold woman. The blood drinker could not resist the lure of the fresh blood leaving the third wife's body. Instinctively, she turned to the dying woman. For 1 second, entirely consumed by thirst. Tahaki's teeth closed around her neck. That was not the end of the fight, but Tahaki was not alone now. Watching their mother die, 2 young sons felt such rage that they sprang forth as their spirit wolves, though they were not yet men. With their father, they finished the creature. Tahaki never rejoined the tribe. He never changed back to a man again. He lay for one day beside the body of the third wife, growling whenever anyone tried to touch her. Then he went into the forest and never returned. Trouble with the cold ones was rare from that time on. Tahaki's sons guarded the tribe until their sons were old enough to take their places. There were never more than 3 wolves at a time. It was enough. Occasionally a blood drinker would come through these lands, but they were taken by surprise, not expecting the wolves. Sometimes a wolf would die, but never were they decimated again like that first time. They'd learned how to fight the cold ones, and they passed the knowledge on, wolf mind to wolf mind, spirit to spirit, father to son. Time passed, and the descendants of Tahaki no longer became wolves when they reached manhood. Only in a great while, if a cold one was near, would the wolves return. The cold ones always came in 1s and 2s, and the pack stayed small. A bigger coven came, and your own great-grandfathers prepared to fight them off. But the leader spoke to Ephraim Black as if he were a man, and promised not to harm the Quileads. His strange yellow eyes gave some proof to his claim they were not the same as the other blood drinkers. The wolves were outnumbered. There was no need for the cold ones to offer a treaty when they could have won the fight. Ephraim accepted. They've stayed true to their side, though their presence does tend to draw in others. And their numbers have forced a larger pack than the tribe has ever seen, old Quill said. And for one moment, his black eyes, all but buried in the wrinkles of skin folded around them, seemed to rest on me. Except, of course, in Tahaki's time, he said, and then sighed. And so the sons of our tribe again carry the burden and share the sacrifice their fathers endured before them. All was silent for a long moment. The living descendants of magic and legend stared at one another across the fire with sadness in their eyes. All but one. Burden, he scoffed in a low voice. I think it's cool. Quill's full lower lip pouted out a little bit. Across the dying fire, Seth Clearwater, his eyes wide with adulation for the fraternity of tribal protectors, nodded his agreement. Billy chuckled, low and long, and the magic seemed to fade into the glowing embers. Suddenly it was just a circle of friends again. Jared flicked a small stone at Quill, and everyone laughed when it made him jump. Low conversations murmured around us, teasing and casual. Leah Clearwater's eyes did not open. I thought I saw something sparkling on her cheek like a tear, but when I looked back a moment later it was gone. Neither Jacob nor I spoke. He was so still beside me, his breath so deep and even that I thought he might be close to sleep. My mind was 1,000 years away. I was not thinking of Yahuta or the other wolves, or the beautiful cold woman. I could picture her only too easily. No, I was thinking of someone outside the magic altogether. I was trying to imagine the face of the unnamed woman who had saved the entire tribe. The third wife. Just a human woman, with no special gifts or powers. Physically weaker and slower than any of the monsters in the story, but she had been the key, the solution. She had saved her husband, her young sons, her tribe. I wished they'd remembered her name. Something shook my arm. Come on, Bells, Jacob said in my ear. We're here. I blinked, confused because the fire seemed to have disappeared. I glared into the unexpected darkness, trying to make sense of my surroundings. It took me a minute to realize that I was no longer on the cliff. Jacob and I were alone. I was still under his arm, but I wasn't on the ground anymore. How did I get in Jacob's car? Oh, crap, I gasped as I realized I had fallen asleep. How late is it? Dang it, where's that stupid phone? I patted my pockets, frantic and coming up empty. Easy. It's not even midnight yet, and I already called him for you. Look, he's waiting there. Midnight, I repeated stupidly, still disoriented. I stared into the darkness, and my heartbeat picked up when my eyes made out the shape of the Volvo, 30 yards away. I reached for the door handle. Here, Jacob said, and he put a small shape into my other hand. The phone. You called Edward for me? My eyes were adjusted enough to see the bright gleam of Jacob's smile. I figured if I played nice, I'd get more time with you. Thanks, Jake, I said, touched. Really, thank you. And thanks for inviting me tonight. That was... Words failed me. Wow, that was something else. And you didn't even stay up to watch me swallow a cow, he laughed. No, I'm glad you liked it. It was nice for me, having you there. There was a movement in the dark distance, something pale ghosting against the black trees. Pacing? Yeah, he's not so patient, is he? Jacob said, noticing my distraction. Go ahead, but come back soon, okay? Sure, Jake, I promised, cracking the car door open. Cold air washed across my legs and made me shiver. Sleep tight, Bells. Don't worry about anything. I'll be watching out for you tonight. I paused, one foot on the ground. No, Jake, get some rest. I'll be fine. Sure, he said, but he sounded more patronizing than agreeing. Night, Jake, thanks. Night, Bella, he whispered as I hurried into the darkness. Edward caught me at the boundary line. Bella, he said, relief strong in his voice. His arms wound tightly around me. Hi, sorry I'm so late. I fell asleep and... I know, Jacob explained. He started toward the car, and I staggered woodenly at his side. Are you tired? I could carry you. I'm fine. Let's get you home and in bed. Did you have a nice time? Yeah, it was amazing, Edward. I wish you could have come. I can't even explain it. Jake's dad told us the old legends, and it was like magic. You'll have to tell me about it after you've slept. I won't get it right, I said, and I yawned hugely. Edward chuckled. He opened my door for me, lifted me in, and buckled my seatbelt around me. Bright lights flashed on and swept across us. I waved toward Jacob's headlights, but I didn't know if he saw the gesture. That night, after I'd gotten past Charlie, who didn't give me as much trouble as I'd expected because Jacob had called him too, instead of collapsing in bed right away, I leaned out the open window while I waited for Edward to come back. The night was surprisingly cold, almost wintry. I hadn't noticed it at all on the windy cliffs. I imagined that had less to do with the fire than it did with sitting next to Jacob. Icy droplets spattered against my face as the rain began to fall. It was too dark to see much besides the black triangles of the spruces leaning and shaking with the wind. But I strained my eyes anyway, searching for other shapes in a storm. A pale silhouette, moving like a ghost through the black. Or maybe the shadowy outline of an enormous wolf. My eyes were too weak. Then there was a movement in the night, right beside me. Edward slid through my open window, his hands colder than the rain. "Is Jacob out there?" I asked, shivering as Edward pulled me into the circle of his arm. "Yes, somewhere. And Esme's on her way home." I sighed. "It's so cold and wet. This is silly." I shivered. He chuckled. "It's only cold to you, Bella." It was cold in my dream that night too. Maybe because I slept in Edward's arms, but I dreamt I was outside in the storm, the wind whipping my hair in my face and blinding my eyes. I stood on the rocky crescent of First Beach, trying to understand the quickly moving shapes I could only dimly see in the darkness at the shore's edge. At first, there was nothing but a flash of white and black, darting toward each other and dancing away. And then, as if the moon had suddenly broken from the clouds, I could see everything. Rosalie, her hair swinging wet and golden down to the back of her knees, lunging at an enormous wolf, its muzzle shot through with silver that I instinctively recognized as Billy Black. I broke into a run, but found myself moving in the frustrating slow motion of dreamers. I tried to scream to them, to tell them to stop, but my voice was stolen by the wind, and I could make no sound. I waved my arms, hoping to catch their attention. Something flashed in my hand, and I noticed for the first time that my right hand wasn't empty. I held a long, sharp blade, ancient and silver, crusted in dried, blackened blood. I cringed away from the knife, and my eyes snapped open to the quiet darkness of my bedroom. The first thing I realized was that I was not alone, and I turned to bury my face in Edward's chest, knowing the sweet scent of his skin would chase the nightmare away more effectively than anything else. "Did I wake you?" he whispered. There was the sound of paper, the ruffling of pages, and a faint thump as something light fell to the wooden floor. "No," I mumbled, sighing in contentment as his arms tightened around me. "I had a bad dream." "Do you want to tell me about it?" I shook my head. "Too tired. Maybe in the morning if I remember." I felt a silent laugh shake through him. "In the morning," he agreed. "What were you reading?" I muttered, not really awake at all. "Wuthering Heights," he said. I frowned sleepily. "I thought you didn't like that book." "You left it out," he murmured, his soft voice lulling me toward unconsciousness. "Besides, the more time I spend with you, the more human emotions seem comprehensible to me. I'm discovering that I can sympathize with Heathcliff in ways I didn't think possible before." I sighed. He said something else, something low, but I was already asleep. The next morning dawned pearl grey and still. Edward asked me about my dream, but I couldn't get a handle on it. I only remembered that I was cold, and that I was glad he was there when I woke up. He kissed me, long enough to get my pulse racing, and then headed home to change and get his car. I dressed quickly, low on options. Whoever had ransacked my hamper had critically impaired my wardrobe. If it wasn't so frightening, it would be seriously annoying. As I was about to head down for breakfast, I noticed my battered copy of Wuthering Heights lying open on the floor where Edward had dropped it in the night, holding his place the way the damaged binding always held mine. I picked it up, curiously, trying to remember what he'd said. Something about feeling sympathy for Heathcliff, of all people. That couldn't be right. I must have dreamed that part. 3 words on the open page caught my eye, and I bent my head to read the paragraph more closely. It was Heathcliff speaking, and I knew the passage well. And there you see the distinction between our feelings. Had he been in my place and I in his? Though I hated him with a hatred that turned my life to gall, I never would have raised a hand against him. You may look incredulous, if you please. I never would have banished him from her society, as long as she desired his. The moment her regard ceased, I would have torn his heart out and drank his blood. But till then, if you don't believe me, you don't know me. Till then, I would have died by inches before I touched a single hair on his head. The 3 words that had caught my eye were drank his blood. I shuddered. Yes, surely I must have dreamt that Edward said anything positive about Heathcliff. And this page was probably not the page he'd been reading. The book could have fallen open to any page. I have foreseen, Alice began in an ominous tone. Edward threw an elbow toward her ribs, which she neatly dodged. Fine, she grumbled. Edward's making me do this, but I did foresee that she would be more difficult if I surprised you. We were walking to the car after school, and I was completely clueless as to what she was talking about. In English, I requested. Don't be a baby about this, no tantrums. Now I'm scared. So, we're having a graduation party. It's no big thing, nothing to freak out over, but I saw that you would freak out if I tried to make it a surprise party. She danced out of the way as Edward reached over to muss her hair. And Edward said I have to tell you, but it's nothing, promise. I sighed heavily. Is there any point in arguing? None at all. Okay, Alice, I'll be there. And I'll hate every minute of it, promise. That's the spirit. By the way, I love my gift. You shouldn't have. Alice, I didn't. Oh, I know that, but you will. I racked my brains in panic, trying to remember what I'd ever decided to get her for graduation that she might have seen. Amazing, Edward muttered. How can someone so tiny be so annoying? Alice laughed. It's a talent. Couldn't you have waited a few weeks to tell me about this? I asked petulantly. Now I'll just be stressed that much longer. Alice frowned at me. Bella, she said slowly, do you know what day it is? Monday? She rolled her eyes. Yes, it is Monday. The 4th. She grabbed my elbow, spun me halfway around and pointed toward a big yellow poster taped to the gym door. There, in sharp black letters, was the date of graduation. Exactly 1 week from today. It's the 4th of June? Are you sure? Neither one answered. Alice shook her head sadly, feigning disappointment, and Edward's eyebrows lifted. It can't be. How did that happen? I tried to count backwards in my head, but I couldn't figure out where the days had gone. I felt like someone had kicked my legs out from under me. The weeks of stress, of worry. Somehow in the middle of all my obsessing over the time, my time had disappeared. My space for sorting through it all, for making plans, had vanished. I was out of time, and I wasn't ready. I didn't know how to do this, how to say goodbye to Charlie and Renee, to Jacob, to being human. I knew exactly what I wanted, but I was suddenly terrified of getting it. In theory, I was anxious, even eager to trade mortality for immortality. After all, it was the key to staying with Edward forever. And then there was the fact that I was being hunted by known and unknown parties. I'd rather not sit around helpless and delicious, waiting for one of them to catch up with me. In theory, that all made sense. In practice, being human was all I knew. The future beyond that was a big, dark abyss that I couldn't know until I leapt into it. This simple knowledge, today's date, which was so obvious that I must have been subconsciously repressing it, made the deadline I'd been impatiently counting down toward feel like a date with the firing squad. In a vague way, I was aware of Edward holding the car door for me, of Alice chattering from the back seat, of the rain hammering against the windshield. Edward seemed to realize I was only there in body. He didn't try to pull me out of my abstraction. Or maybe he did, and I was past noticing. We ended up at my house, where Edward led me to the sofa and pulled me down next to him. I stared out the window, into the liquid grey haze, and I tried to find where my resolve had gone. Why was I panicking now? I'd known the deadline was coming, why should it frighten me that it was here? I didn't know how long he let me stare out the window in silence, but the rain was disappearing into darkness when it was finally too much for him. He put his cold hands on either side of my face and fixed his golden eyes on mine. Would you please tell me what you were thinking before I go mad? What could I say to him? That I was a coward? I searched for words. Your lips are white. Talk, Bella. I exhaled in a big gust. How long had I been holding my breath? The date took me off guard, I whispered. That's all. He waited, his face full of worry and skepticism. I tried to explain. I'm not sure what to do. What to tell Charlie, what to say, how to... My voice trailed off. This isn't about the party. I frowned. No, but thanks for reminding me. The rain was louder as he read my face. You're not ready, he whispered. I am, I lied immediately, a reflex reaction. I could tell he saw through it, so I took a deep breath and told the truth. I have to be. You don't have to be anything. I could feel the panic surfacing in my eyes as I mouthed the reasons. Victoria, Jane, Caius, whoever was in my room. All the more reason to wait. That doesn't make any sense, Edward. He pressed his hands more tightly to my face and spoke with a slow deliberation. Bella, not one of us had a choice. You've seen what it's done, to Rosalie especially. We've all struggled, trying to reconcile ourselves with something we had no control over. I won't let it be that way for you. You will have a choice. I've already made my choice. You aren't going through with this because a sword is hanging over your head. We will take care of the problems, and I will take care of you. When we're through it, and there is nothing forcing your hand, then you can decide to join me if you still want to. But not because you're afraid. You won't be forced into this. Carlyle promised, I mumbled, contrary out of habit. After graduation. Not until you're ready, he said in a sure voice. And definitely not while you feel threatened. I didn't answer. I didn't have it in me to argue. I couldn't seem to find my commitment at the moment. There, he kissed my forehead. Nothing to worry about. I laughed a shaky laugh. Nothing but impending doom. Trust me. I do. He was still watching my face, waiting for me to relax. Can I ask you something? I said. Anything. I hesitated, biting my lip, and then asked a different question than the one I was worried about. What am I getting Alice for graduation? He snickered. It looked like you were getting us both concert tickets. That's right. I was so relieved. I almost smiled. The concert in Tacoma. I saw an ad in the paper last week, and I thought it would be something you'd like, since you said it was a good CD. It's a great idea. Thank you. I hope it's not sold out. It's the thought that counts. I ought to know. I sighed. There's something else you meant to ask, he said. I frowned. You're good. I have lots of practice reading your face. Ask me. I closed my eyes and leaned into him, hiding my face against his chest. You don't want me to be a vampire? No, I don't, he said softly, and then he waited for more. That's not a question, he prompted after a moment. Well, I was worrying about why you feel that way. Worrying, he picked out the word with surprise. Would you tell me why? The whole truth, not sparing my feelings. He hesitated for a moment. If I answer your question, will you then explain your question? I nodded, my face still hidden. He took a deep breath before he answered. You could do so much better, Bella. I know that you believe I have a soul, but I'm not entirely convinced on that point, and to risk yours. He shook his head slowly. For me to allow this, to let you become what I am, just so that I'll never have to lose you, it's the most selfish act I can imagine. I want it, more than anything, for myself. But for you, I want so much more. Giving in, it feels criminal. It's the most selfish thing I'll ever do, even if I live forever. If there were any way for me to become human for you, no matter what the price was, I would pay it. I sat very still, absorbing this. Edward thought he was being selfish. I felt the smile slowly spread across my face. So, it's not that you're afraid you won't like me as much when I'm different? When I'm not soft and warm and I don't smell the same? You really do want to keep me, no matter how I turn out? He exhaled sharply. You were worried I wouldn't like you, he demanded. Then before I could answer, he was laughing. Bella, for a fairly intuitive person, you can be so obtuse. I knew he would think it silly, but I was relieved. If he really wanted me, I could get through the rest, somehow. Selfish suddenly seemed like a beautiful word. I don't think you realize how much easier it will be for me, Bella. The echo of his humor still there in his voice. When I don't have to concentrate all the time on not killing you, certainly there are things I'll miss. This, for one. He stared into my eyes as he stroked my cheek. and I felt the blood rush up to color my skin. He laughed gently. And the sound of your heart, he continued, more serious but still smiling a little. It's the most significant sound in the world. I'm so attuned to it now, I swear I could pick it out from miles away. But neither of these things matter. This, he said, taking my face in his hands. You. That's what I'm keeping. You'll always be my Bella. You'll just be a little more durable. I sighed and let my eyes close in contentment, resting there in his hands. Now, will you answer a question for me? The whole truth, not sparing my feelings, he asked. Of course, I answered at once, my eyes opening wide with surprise. What would he want to know? He spoke the words slowly. You don't want to be my wife. My heart stopped, and then broke into a sprint. A cold sweat dewed on the back of my neck, and my hands turned to ice. He waited, watching, listening to my reaction. That's not a question, I finally whispered. He looked down, his lashes casting long shadows across his cheekbones, and dropped his hands from my face to pick up my frozen left hand. He played with my fingers while he spoke. I was worrying why you felt that way. I tried to swallow. That's not a question either, I whispered. Please, Bella. The truth, I asked, only mouthing the words. Of course. I can take it, whatever it is. I took a deep breath. You're gonna laugh at me. His eyes flashed up to mine, shocked. Laugh? I cannot imagine that. You'll see, I muttered, and then I sighed. My face went from white to scarlet in a sudden blaze of chagrin. Okay, fine, I'm sure this will sound like some big joke to you, but really, it's just so embarrassing, I confessed and hid my face against his chest. There was a brief pause. I'm not following you. I tilted my head back and glared at him, embarrassment making me lash out, belligerent. I'm not that girl, Edward. The one who gets married right out of high school like some small-town hick who got knocked up by her boyfriend. Do you know what people would think? Do you realize what century this is? People don't just get married at 18. Not smart people, not responsible, mature people. I wasn't going to be that girl. That's not who I am. I trailed off, losing steam. Edward's face was impossible to read as he thought through my answer. That's all, he finally asked. I blinked. Isn't that enough? It's not that you are more eager for immortality itself than for just me. And then, though I'd predicted that he would laugh, I was suddenly the one having hysterics. Edward, I gasped out between the paroxysms of giggles. And here, I always thought that you were so much smarter than me. He took me in his arms, and I could feel that he was laughing with me. Edward, I said, managing to speak more clearly with a little effort. There's no point to forever without you. I wouldn't want one day without you. Well, that's a relief, he said. Still, it doesn't change anything. It's nice to understand, though. And I do understand your perspective, Bella. Truly I do. but I'd like it very much if you'd try to consider mine. I'd sobered up by then, so I nodded and struggled to keep the frown off my face. His liquid gold eyes turned hypnotic as they held mine. You see, Bella, I was always that boy. In my world, I was already a man. I wasn't looking for love, no, I was far too eager to be a soldier for that. I thought of nothing but the idealized glory of the war that they were selling prospective draftees then. But if I had found... He paused, cocking his head to the side. I was going to say if I had found someone, but that won't do. If I had found you, there isn't a doubt in my mind how I would have proceeded. I was that boy who would have, as soon as I discovered that you were what I was looking for, gotten down on one knee and endeavored to secure your hand. I would have wanted you for eternity, even when the word didn't have quite the same connotations. He smiled his crooked smile at me. I stared at him with my eyes frozen wide. Breathe, Bella, he reminded me, smiling. I breathed. Can you see my side, Bella? Even a little bit. And for 1 second I could. I saw myself in a long skirt and a high-necked lace blouse with my hair piled up on my head. I saw Edward, looking dashing in a light suit with a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand, sitting beside me on a porch swing. I shook my head and swallowed. I was just having Anne of Green Gables flashbacks. The thing is, Edward, I said in a shaky voice, avoiding the question. In my mind, marriage and eternity are not mutually exclusive or mutually inclusive concepts, and since we're living in my world for the moment, maybe we should go with the times, if you know what I mean. But, on the other hand, he countered, you will soon be leaving time behind you altogether. So why should the transitory customs of one local culture affect the decision so much? I pursed my lips. When in Rome? He laughed at me. You don't have to say yes or no today, Bella. It's good to understand both sides, though, don't you think? So your condition is still in effect. I do see your point, Bella, but if you want me to change you myself... Dum-dum-da-dum, I hummed under my breath. I was going for the wedding march, but it sort of sounded like a dirge. Time continued to move too fast. The night flew by dreamlessly, and then it was morning, and graduation was staring me in the face. I had a pile of studying to do for my finals that I knew I wouldn't get halfway through in the few days I had left. When I came down for breakfast, Charlie was already gone. He'd left the paper on the table, and that reminded me that I had some shopping to do. I hoped the ad for the concert was still running. I needed the phone number to get the stupid tickets. It didn't seem like much of a gift now that all the surprise was gone. Of course, trying to surprise Alice wasn't the brightest plan to begin with. I meant to flip right back to the entertainment section, but the thick black headline caught my attention. I felt a thrill of fear as I leaned closer to read the front page story. Seattle terrorized by slayings. It's been less than a decade since the city of Seattle was the hunting ground for the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, was convicted of the murders of 48 women. and now a beleaguered Seattle must face the possibility that it could be harboring an even more horrifying monster at this very moment. The police are not calling the recent rash of homicides and disappearances the work of a serial killer, not yet at least. They are reluctant to believe so much carnage could be the work of one individual. This killer, if in fact it is one person, would then be responsible for 39 linked homicides and disappearances within the last 3 months alone. In comparison, Ridgway's 48-count murder spree was scattered over a 21-year period. If these deaths can be linked to one man, then this is the most violent rampage of serial murder in American history. The police are leaning instead toward the theory that gang activity is involved. This theory is supported by the sheer number of victims, and by the fact that there seems to be no pattern in the choice of victims. From Jack the Ripper to Ted Bundy, the targets of serial killings are usually connected by similarities in age, gender, race, or a combination of the three. The victims of this crime wave range in age from 15-year-old honor student Amanda Reed to 67-year-old retired postman Omar Jenks. The linked deaths include a nearly even 18 women and 21 men. The victims are racially diverse: Caucasians, African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians. The selection appears random. The motive seems to be killing for no other reason than to kill. So why even consider the idea of a serial killer? There are enough similarities in the modus operandi to rule out unrelated crimes. Every victim discovered has been burned, to the extent that dental records were necessary for identification. The use of some kind of accelerant like gasoline or alcohol seems to be indicated in the conflagrations. However, no traces of any accelerant have yet been found. All of the bodies have been carelessly dumped with no attempt at concealment. More gruesome yet, most of the remains show evidence of brutal violence. Bones crushed and snapped by some kind of tremendous pressure, which medical examiners believe occurred before the time of death, though these conclusions are difficult to be sure of, considering the state of the evidence. Another similarity that points to the possibility of a serial: every crime is perfectly clean of evidence, aside from the remains themselves. Not a fingerprint, not a tire tread mark, nor a foreign hair left behind. There have been no sightings of any suspect in the disappearances. Then there are the disappearances themselves, hardly low profile by any means. None of the victims are what could be viewed as easy targets. None are runaways or the homeless who vanish so easily and are seldom reported missing. Victims have vanished from their homes, from a 4th-story apartment, from a health club, from a wedding reception. Perhaps the most astounding, a 30-year-old amateur boxer, Robert Walsh, entered a movie theater with a date. A few minutes into the movie, the woman realized he was not in his seat. His body was found 3 hours later when firefighters were called to the scene of a burning trash dumpster, 20 miles away. Another pattern is present in the slayings. All of the victims disappeared at night. And the most alarming pattern? Acceleration. 6 of the homicides were committed in the first month, 11 in the second. 22 have occurred in the last 10 days alone, and the police are no closer to finding the responsible party than they were after the first child body was discovered. The evidence is conflicting, the pieces horrifying. A vicious new gang or a wildly active serial killer? Or something else the police haven't yet conceived of. Only one conclusion is indisputable. Something hideous is stalking Seattle. It took me 3 tries to read the last sentence, and I realized the problem was my shaking hands. Bella? Focused as I was, Edward's voice, though quiet and not totally unexpected, made me gasp and whirl. He was leaning in the doorway, his eyebrows pulled together. Then he was suddenly at my side, taking my hand. Did I startle you? I'm sorry, I did knock. No, I said quickly. Have you seen this? I pointed to the paper. A frown creased his forehead. I hadn't seen today's news yet, but I knew it was getting worse. We're going to have to do something, quickly. I didn't like that. I hated any of them taking chances, and whatever or whoever was in Seattle was truly beginning to frighten me. But the idea of the Volturi coming was just as scary. What does Alice say? That's the problem. His frown hardened. She can't see anything. That we've made up our minds half a dozen times to check it out. She's starting to lose confidence. She feels like she's missing too much these days, that something's wrong, that maybe her vision is slipping away. My eyes were wide. Can that happen? Who knows? No one's ever done a study, but I really doubt it. These things tend to intensify over time. Look at Aro and Jane. Then what's wrong? Self-fulfilling prophecy, I think. We keep waiting for Alice to see something so we can go. And she doesn't see anything because we won't really go until she does. So she can't see us there. Maybe we'll have to do it blind. I shuddered. No. Did you have a strong desire to attend class today? We're only a couple of days from finals. They won't be giving us anything new. I think I can live without school for a day. What are we doing? I want to talk to Jasper. Jasper. Again, it was strange. In the Cullen family, Jasper was always a little on the fringe. Part of things, but never the center of them. It was my unspoken assumption that he was only there for Alice. I had the sense that he would follow Alice anywhere, but that this lifestyle was not his first choice. The fact that he was less committed to it than the others was probably why he had more difficulty keeping it up. At any rate, I'd never seen Edward feel dependent on Jasper. I wondered again what he'd meant about Jasper's expertise. I really didn't know much about Jasper's history, just that he had come from somewhere in the south before Alice found him. For some reason, Edward had always shied away from any questions about his newest brother, and I'd always been too intimidated by the tall blonde vampire who looked like a brooding movie star to ask him outright. When we got to the house, we found Carlyle, Esme, and Jasper watching the news intently, though the sound was so low that it was unintelligible to me. Alice was perched on the bottom step of the grand staircase, her face in her hands and her expression discouraged. As we walked in, Emmett ambled through the kitchen door, seeming perfectly at ease. Nothing ever bothered Emmett. Hey, Edward. Ditching Bella? He grinned at me. We both are, Edward reminded him. Emmett laughed. Yeah, but it's her first time through high school. She might miss something. Edward rolled his eyes, but otherwise ignored his favorite brother. He tossed the paper to Carlyle. Did you see that they're considering a serial killer now? He asked. Carlyle sighed. They've had 2 specialists debating that possibility on CNN all morning. We can't let this go on. Let's go now, Emmett said with sudden enthusiasm. I'm dead bored. A hiss echoed down the stairway from upstairs. She's such a pessimist, Emmett muttered to himself. Edward agreed with Emmett. We'll have to go sometime. Rosalie appeared at the top of the stairs and descended slowly. Her face was smooth, expressionless. Carlyle was shaking his head. I'm concerned. We've never involved ourselves in this kind of thing before. It's not our business. We aren't the Volturi. I don't want the Volturi to have to come here, Edward said. It gives us so much less reaction time. And all those innocent humans in Seattle, Esme murmured. It's not right to let them die this way. I know, Carlyle sighed. Oh, Edward said sharply, turning his head slightly to look at Jasper. I didn't think of that. I see. You're right, that has to be it. Well, that changes everything. I wasn't the only one who stared at him in confusion, but I might have been the only one who didn't look slightly annoyed. I think you'd better explain to the others, Edward said to Jasper. What could be the purpose of this? Edward started to pace, staring at the floor, lost in thought. I hadn't seen her get up, but Alice was there beside me. What is he rambling about? She asked Jasper. What are you thinking? Jasper didn't seem to enjoy the spotlight. He hesitated, reading every face in the circle, for everyone had moved in to hear what he would say. And then his eyes paused on my face. You're confused, he said to me, his deep voice very quiet. There was no question in his assumption. Jasper knew what I was feeling, what everyone was feeling. We're all confused, Emmett grumbled. You can afford the time to be patient, Jasper told him. Bella should understand this. She's one of us now. His words took me by surprise. As little as I'd had to do with Jasper, especially since my last birthday when he tried to kill me, I hadn't realized that he thought of me that way. How much do you know about me, Bella? Jasper asked. Emmett sighed theatrically and plopped down on the couch to wait with exaggerated impatience. Not much, I admitted. Jasper stared at Edward, who looked up to meet his gaze. No, Edward answered his thought. I'm sure you can understand why I haven't told her that story, but I suppose she needs to hear it now. Jasper nodded thoughtfully, and then started to roll up the arm of his ivory sweater. I watched, curious and confused, trying to figure out what he was doing. He held his wrist under the edge of the lampshade beside him, close to the light of the naked bulb, and traced his finger across a raised crescent mark on the pale skin. It took me a minute to understand why the shape looked strangely familiar. Oh, I breathed as realization hit. Jasper, you have a scar exactly like mine. I held out my hand, the silvery crescent more prominent against my cream skin than against his alabaster. Jasper smiled faintly. I have a lot of scars like yours, Bella. Jasper's face was unreadable as he pushed the sleeve of his thin sweater higher up his arm. At first, my eyes could not make sense of the texture that was layered thickly across the skin. Curved half-moons crisscrossed in a feathery pattern that was only visible, white on white as it was, because of the bright glow of the lamp beside him, throwing the slightly raised design into relief with shallow shadows outlining the shapes. And then I gasped. The pattern was made of individual crescents like the ones on his wrist, the one on my hand. I looked back at my own small solitary scar and remembered how I had received it. I stared at the shape of James's teeth, embossed forever on my skin. And then I gasped, staring up at him. Jasper, what happened to you? The same thing that happened to your hand, Jasper answered in a quiet voice, repeated 1,000 times. He laughed a little ruefully and brushed at his arm. Our venom is the only thing that leaves a scar. Why? I breathed in horror, feeling rude but unable to stop staring at his subtly ravaged skin. I didn't have quite the same upbringing as my adopted siblings here. My beginning was something else entirely. His voice turned hard as he finished. I gasped at him, appalled. "Before I tell you my story," Jasper said, "you must understand that there are places in our world, Bella, where the lifespan of the never-aging is measured in weeks and not centuries." The others had heard this before. Carlisle and Emmett turned their attention to the TV again. Alice moved silently to sit at Esme's feet. But Edward was just as absorbed as I was. I could feel his eyes on my face, reading every flicker of emotion. To really understand why, you have to look at the world from a different perspective. You have to imagine the way it looks to the powerful, the greedy, the perpetually thirsty. You see, there are places in this world that are more desirable to us than others. Places where we can be less restrained and still avoid detection. Picture, for instance, a map of the Western Hemisphere. Picture on it every human life as a small red dot. The thicker the red, the more easily we, those who exist this way, can feed without attracting notice. I shuddered at the image in my head, at the word feed. But Jasper wasn't worried about frightening me, not overprotective like Edward always was. He went on without a pause. Not that the covens in the south care much for what the humans notice or do not. It's the Volturi that keep them in check. They're the only ones the southern covens fear. If not for the Volturi, the rest of us would be quickly exposed. I frowned at the way he pronounced the name, with respect, almost gratitude. The idea of the Volturi as the good guys in any sense was hard to accept. The North is, by comparison, very civilized. Mostly we're nomads here who enjoy the day as well as the night, who allow humans to interact with us unsuspectingly. Anonymity is important to us all. It's a different world in the South. The immortals there come out only at night. They spend the day plotting their next move or anticipating their enemies. Because it has been war in the South. Constant war for centuries, with never one moment of truce. The covens there barely note the existence of humans, except as soldiers notice a herd of cows by the wayside. Food for the taking. They only hide from the notice of the herd because of the Volturi. But what are they fighting for, I asked. Jasper smiled. Remember the map with the red dots? He waited, so I nodded. They fight for control of the thickest red. You see, it occurred to someone once that if he were the only vampire in, let's say, Mexico City, he could feed every night, twice, 3 times, no one would ever notice. He plotted ways to get rid of the competition. Others had the same idea. Some came with more effective tactics than others. But the most effective tactic was invented by a fairly young vampire named Benito. First anyone ever heard of him, he came down from somewhere north of Dallas and massacred the 2 small covens that shared the area near Houston. 2 nights later, he took on the much stronger clan of allies that claimed Monterrey in northern Mexico. Again, he won. How did he win? I asked with wary curiosity. Benito had created an army of newborn vampires. He was the first one to think of it, and in the beginning he was unstoppable. Very young vampires are volatile, wild, and almost impossible to control. One newborn can be reasoned with, taught to restrain himself, but 10, 15 together are a nightmare. They'll turn on each other as easily as on the enemy you point them at. Benito had to keep making more as they fought amongst themselves, and as the covens he decimated took more than half his force down before they lost. You see, though, newborns are dangerous. They're still possible to defeat if you know what you're doing. They're incredibly powerful physically for the first year or so, and if they're allowed to bring strength to bear, they can crush an old vampire with ease. But they are slaves to their instincts, and thus predictable. Usually they have no skills in fighting, only muscle and ferocity, and in this case, overwhelming numbers. The vampires in southern Mexico realized what was coming for them, and they did the only thing they could think of to counteract Benito. They made armies of their own. All hell broke loose. And I mean that more literally than you can possibly imagine. We immortals have our histories too, and this particular war will never be forgotten. Of course, it was not a good time to be a human in Mexico either. I shuddered. When the body count reached epidemic proportions, in fact, your histories blame a disease for the population slump, the Volturi finally stepped in. The entire guard came together and sought out every newborn in the bottom half of North America. Benito was entrenched in Puebla, building his army as quickly as he could, in order to take the prize, Mexico City. The Volturi started with him, and then moved on to the rest. Anyone who was found with the newborns was executed immediately. And since everyone was trying to protect themselves from Benito, Mexico was emptied of vampires for a time. The Volturi were cleaning house for almost a year. This was another chapter of our history that will always be remembered, though there are very few witnesses left to speak of what it was like. I spoke to someone once who had, from a distance, watched what happened when they visited Culiacan. Jasper shuddered. I realized that I had never before seen him either afraid or horrified. This was a first. It was enough that the fever for conquest did not spread from the south. The rest of the world stayed sane. We owe the Volturi for our present way of life. But when the Volturi went back to Italy, the survivors were quick to stake their claims in the south. Didn't take long before covens began to dispute again. There was a lot of bad blood, if you'll forgive the expression. Vendettas abounded. The idea of newborns was already there. Some were not able to resist. However, the Volturi had not been forgotten, and the southern covens were more careful this time. The newborns were selected from the human pool with more care, given more training. They were used circumspectly, and the humans remained for the most part oblivious. Their creators gave the Volturi no reason to return. The wars resumed, but on a smaller scale. Every now and then, someone would go too far. Speculation would begin in the human newspapers. The Volturi return, clean out the city. But they let the others, the careful ones, continue. Jasper was staring off into space. That's how you were changed. My realization was a whisper. Yes, he agreed. When I was a human, I lived in Houston, Texas. I was almost 17 years old when I joined the Confederate Army in 1861. I lied to the recruiters and told them I was 20. I was tall enough to get away with it. My military career was short-lived, but very promising. People always liked me, listened to what I had to say. My father said it was charisma. Of course, now I know it was probably something more. Whatever the reason, I was promoted quickly through the ranks, over older, more experienced men. The Confederate Army was new and scrambling to organize itself, so that provided opportunities as well. By the first Battle of Galveston, well, more of a skirmish really, I was the youngest major in Texas, not even acknowledging my real age. I was placed in charge of evacuating the women and children from the city when the Union's mortar boats reached the harbor. It took a day to prepare them, and then I left with the first column of civilians to convey them to Houston. I remember that one night very clearly. We reached the sea after dark. I stayed only long enough to make sure the entire party was safely situated. Soon as that was done, I got myself a fresh horse, and I headed back to Galveston. It wasn't time to rest. Just a mile outside the city, I found 3 women on foot. I assumed they were stragglers and dismounted at once to offer them my aid. But when I could see their faces in the dim light of the moon, I was stunned into silence. They were without question the 3 most beautiful women I had ever seen. They had such pale skin. I remember marveling at it. Even the little black-haired girl, whose features were clearly Mexican, was porcelain in the moonlight. And they seemed young, all of them, still young enough to be called girls. I knew they were not lost members of our party. I would have remembered seeing these 3. "He's speechless," the tallest girl said in a lovely, delicate voice. It was like wind chimes. She had fair hair and her skin was snow white. The other was blonder still, her skin just as chalky, her face like an angel's. She leaned toward me with half-closed eyes and inhaled deeply. She sighed. Lovely. The small one, the tiny brunette, put her hand on the girl's arm and spoke quickly. Her voice was too soft and musical to be sharp, but that seemed to be the way she intended it. "Concentrate, Nettie," she said. I'd always had a good sense of how people related to each other, and it was immediately clear that the brunette was somehow in charge of the others. If they'd been military, I would have said that she outranked them. "He looks right. Young, strong, an officer." The brunette paused, and I tried unsuccessfully to speak. "There's something more. Do you sense it?" she asked the other 2. "He's compelling." "Oh yes," Nettie quickly agreed, leaning toward me again. "Patience," the brunette cautioned her. "I want to keep this one." Nettie frowned. She seemed annoyed. "You'd better do it, Maria," the taller blonde spoke again. "If he's important to you, I kill them twice as often as I keep him." "Yes, I'll do it," Maria agreed. "I really do like this one. Take Nettie away, will you? I don't want to have to protect my back while I'm trying to focus." My hair was standing up on the back of my neck, though I didn't understand the meaning of anything the beautiful creatures were saying. My instincts told me that there was danger, that the angel had meant it when she spoke of killing. But my judgment overruled my instincts. I had not been taught to fear women, but to protect them. "Let's hunt," Nettie agreed enthusiastically, reaching for the tall girl's hand. They wheeled. They were so graceful and sprinted toward the city. They seemed to almost take flight. They were so fast. Their white dresses blew out behind them like wings. I blinked in amazement, and they were gone. I turned to stare at Maria, who was watching me curiously. I'd never been superstitious in my life until that second. I'd never believed in ghosts or any other such nonsense. Suddenly, I was unsure. "What's your name, soldier?" Maria asked me. Major Jasper Whitlock, ma'am," I stammered, unable to be polite to a female, even if she was a ghost. "I truly hope you survive, Jasper," she said in her gentle voice. "I have a good feeling about you." She took a step closer and inclined her head as if she were going to kiss me. I stood, frozen in place, though my instincts were screaming at me to run. Jasper paused, his face thoughtful. A few days later, he finally said, and I wasn't sure if he had edited his story for my sake or because he was responding to the tension that even I could feel exuding from Edward. I was introduced to my new life. Their names were Maria, Nettie, and Lucy. They hadn't been together long. Maria had rounded up the other two. All three were survivors of recently lost battles. Theirs was a partnership of convenience. Maria wanted revenge, and she wanted her territories back. The others were eager to increase their herd lands, I suppose you could say. They were putting together an army, and going about it more carefully than was usual. It was Maria's idea. She wanted a superior army, so she sought out specific humans who had potential. Then she gave us much more attention, more training than anyone had bothered with. She taught us to fight, and she taught us to be invisible to the humans. When we did well, we were rewarded. He paused, editing again. She was in a hurry, though. Maria knew that the massive strength of the newborn began to wane around the year mark, and she wanted to act while we were strong. There were 6 of us when I joined Maria's band. She added 4 more within a fortnight. We were all male. Maria wanted soldiers, and that made it slightly more difficult to keep from fighting amongst ourselves. I fought my first battles against my new comrades in arms. I was quicker than the others, better at combat. Maria was pleased with me, though put out that she had to keep replacing the ones I destroyed. I was rewarded often, and that made me stronger. Maria was a good judge of character. She decided to put me in charge of the others, as if I were being promoted. It suited my nature exactly. Casualties went down dramatically, and our numbers swelled to hover around 20. This was considerable for the cautious times we lived in. My ability, as yet undefined, to control the emotional atmosphere around me was vitally effective. We soon began to work together in a way that newborn vampires had never cooperated before. Even Maria, Nettie, and Lucy were able to work together more easily. Maria grew quite fond of me. She began to depend upon me. And in some ways, I worshipped the ground she walked on. I had no idea that any other life was possible. Maria told us that this was the way things were, and we believed. She asked me to tell her when my brothers and I were ready to fight, and I was eager to prove myself. I pulled together an army of 23 in the end, 23 unbelievably strong new vampires, organized and skilled as no others before. Maria was ecstatic. We crept down toward Monterey, her former home, and she unleashed us on her enemies. They had only 9 newborns at the time, and a pair of older vampires controlling them. We took them down more easily than Maria could believe, losing only 4 in the process. It was an unheard-of margin of victory. And we were well trained. We did it without attracting notice. The city changed hands without any human being aware. Success made Maria greedy. It wasn't long before she began to eye other cities. That first year, she extended her control to cover most of Texas and northern Mexico. Then the others came from the south to dislodge her. He brushed 2 fingers along the faint pattern of scars on his arm. The fighting was intense. Many began to worry the Volturi would return. Of the original 23, I was the only one to survive the first 18 months. We both won and lost. Nettie and Lucy turned on Maria eventually, but that one we won. Maria and I were able to hold on to Monterey. It quieted a little, though the wars continued. The idea of conquest was dying out. It was mostly vengeance and feuding now. So many have lost their partners, and that is something our kind does not forgive. Maria and I always kept a dozen or so newborns ready. They meant little to us. They were pawns. They were disposable. When they outgrew their usefulness, we did dispose of them. My life continued in the same violent pattern, and the years passed. I was sick of it all for a very long time before anything changed. Decades later, I developed a friendship with a newborn who'd remained useful, survived his first 3 years against the odds. His name was Peter. I liked Peter. He was civilized. I suppose that's the right word. He didn't enjoy the fight, though he was good at it. He was assigned to deal with the newborns, babysit them, you could say. It was a full-time job. And then it was time to purge again. The newborns were outgrowing their strength. They were due to be replaced. Peter was supposed to help me dispose of them. We took them aside individually, you see, one by one. It was always a very long night. This time, he tried to convince me that a few had potential. But Maria had instructed that we get rid of them all. I told him no. We were about halfway through, and I could feel that it was taking a great toll on Peter. I was trying to decide whether or not I should send him away and finish up myself as I called out the next victim. To my surprise, he was suddenly angry, furious. I braced for whatever his mood might foreshadow. He was a good fighter, but he was never a match for me. The newborn I'd summoned was a female, just past her year mark. Her name was Charlotte. His feelings changed when she came into view. They gave him away. He yelled for her to run, and he bolted after her. I could have pursued them, but I didn't. I felt averse to destroying him. Maria was irritated with me for that. 5 years later, Peter snuck back for me. He picked a good day to arrive. Maria was mystified by my ever-deteriorating frame of mind. She'd never felt a moment's depression, and I wondered why I was different. I began to notice a change in her emotions when she was near me. Sometimes there was fear and malice, the same feelings that had given me advance warning when Nettie and Lucy struck. I was preparing myself to destroy my only ally, the core of my existence, when Peter returned. Peter told me about his new life with Charlotte, told me about options I'd never dreamed I had. In 5 years, they had never had a fight, though they'd met many others in the north, others who could coexist without the constant mayhem. In one conversation, he had me convinced. I was ready to go, and somewhat relieved I wouldn't have to kill Maria. I'd been her companion for as many years as Carlisle and Edward have been together, yet the bond between us was nowhere near as strong. When you live for the fight, for the blood, the relationships you form are tenuous and easily broken. I walked away without a backward glance. I traveled with Peter and Charlotte for a few years, feeling the feel of this new, more peaceful world. But the depression didn't fade. I didn't understand what was wrong with me until Peter noticed that it was always worse after I'd hunted. I contemplated that. In so many years of slaughter and carnage, I'd lost nearly all my humanity. I was undeniably a nightmare, a monster of the grisliest kind. Yet each time I found another human victim, I would feel a faint prick of remembrance for that other life. Watching their eyes widen in wonder at my beauty, I could see Maria and the others in my head, what they had looked like to me the last night that I was Jasper Whitlock. It was stronger for me, this borrowed memory, more than it was for anyone else, because I could feel everything my prey was feeling, and I lived their emotions as I killed them. You've experienced the way I can manipulate the emotions around myself, Bella, but I wonder if you realize how the feelings in a room affect me. I live every day in a climate of emotion. For the first century of my life, I lived in a world of bloodthirsty vengeance. Hate was my constant companion. It eased some when I left Maria, but I still had to feel the horror and fear of my prey. It began to be too much. The depression got worse, and I wandered away from Peter and Charlotte. Civilized as they were, they didn't feel the same aversion I was beginning to feel. They only wanted peace from the fight. I was so wearied by killing anyone, even mere humans. Yet I had to keep killing. What choice did I have? I tried to kill less often, but I would get too thirsty and I would give in. After a century of instant gratification, I found self-discipline challenging. I still haven't perfected that. Jasper was lost in the story, as was I. It surprised me when his desolate expression smoothed into a peaceful smile. I was in Philadelphia. There was a storm, and I was out during the day, something I was not completely comfortable with yet. I knew standing in the rain would attract attention, so I ducked into a little half-empty diner. My eyes were dark enough that no one would notice them, though this meant I was thirsty, and that worried me a little. She was there, expecting me naturally. He chuckled once. She hopped down from the high stool at the counter as soon as I walked in and came directly toward me. It shocked me. I was not sure if she meant to attack. That's the only interpretation of her behavior my past had to offer, but she was smiling. And the emotions that were emanating from her were like nothing I'd ever felt before. "You've kept me waiting a long time," she said. I didn't realize Alice had come to stand behind me again. And you ducked your head like a good southern gentleman and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am." Alice laughed at the memory. Jasper smiled down at her. You held out your hand and took it without stopping to make sense of what I was doing. For the first time in almost a century, I felt hope. Jasper took Alice's hand as he spoke. Alice grinned. I was just relieved. I thought you were never going to show up. They smiled at each other for a long moment, and then Jasper looked back at me, the soft expression lingering. Alice told me what she had seen of Carlyle and his family. I could hardly believe that such an existence was possible, but Alice made me optimistic. So we went to find them. Scared the hell out of them too, Edward said, rolling his eyes at Jasper before turning to me to explain. Emmett and I were away hunting. Jasper shows up, covered in battle scars, towing this little freak. He nudged Alice playfully, who greets them all by name, knows everything about them, and wants to know which room she can move into. Alice and Jasper laughed in harmony, soprano and bass. When I got home, all my things were in the garage, Edward continued. Alice shrugged. Your room had the best view. They all laughed together now. That's a nice story, I said. 3 pairs of eyes questioned my sanity. I mean, the last part, I defended myself. The happy ending, with Alice. Alice has made all the difference, Jasper agreed. This is a climate I enjoy. But the momentary pause in the stress couldn't last. An army, Alice whispered. Why didn't you tell me? The others were intent again, their eyes locked on Jasper's face. I thought I must be interpreting the signs incorrectly. Because where's the motive? Why would someone create an army in Seattle? There's no history there, no vendetta. It makes no sense from a conquest standpoint either. No one claims it. Nomads pass through, but there's no one to fight for it. No one to defend it from. But I've seen this before. There's no other explanation. There is an army of newborn vampires in Seattle. Fewer than 20, I'd guess. The difficult part is that they're totally untrained. Whoever made them just set them loose. It will only get worse. And it won't be much longer till the Volturi step in. Actually, I'm surprised they've let it go this long. What can we do? Carlyle asked. If we want to avoid the Volturi's involvement, we have to destroy the newborns. And we will have to do it very soon. Jasper's face was hard. Knowing his story now, I could guess how this evaluation might disturb him. I can teach you how. Won't be easy in the city. The young ones aren't concerned about secrecy, but we will have to be. It will limit us in ways that they are not. Maybe we can lure them out. Maybe we don't have to. Edward's voice was bleak. Does it occur to anyone else that the only possible threat in the area that would call for the creation of an army is us? Jasper's eyes narrowed. Carlyle's widened, shocked. Tanya's family is also near, Esme said slowly, unwilling to accept Edward's words. The newborns aren't ravaging Anchorage, Esme. I think we might have to consider the idea that we are the targets. They're not coming after us, Alice insisted, and then paused. Or they don't know that they are. Not yet. What is that? Edward asked, curious and tense. What are you remembering? Flickers, Alice said. I can't see a clear picture when I try to see what's going on. Nothing concrete. But I've been getting strange flashes. Not enough to make sense of, It's as if someone's changing their mind, moving from one course of action to another so quickly that I can't get a good view. Indecision? Jasper asked in disbelief. I don't know. Not indecision, Edward growled. Knowledge. Someone who knows you can't see anything until the decision is made. Someone who is hiding from us, playing with the holes in your vision. Who would know that? Alice whispered. Edward's eyes were as hard as ice. Aro knows you as well as you know yourself. But I would see if they'd decided to come. Unless they didn't want to get their hands dirty. A favor, Rosalie suggested, speaking for the first time. Someone in the south, someone who already had trouble with the rules, someone who should have been destroyed is offered a second chance. If they take care of this one small problem, that would explain the Volturi's sluggish response. Why? Carlyle asked, still shocked. There's no reason for the Volturi. It was there. Edward disagreed quietly. I'm surprised it's come to this so soon, because the other thoughts were stronger. In Aro's head, he saw me at his one side and Alice at his other. The present and the future. Virtual omniscience. The power of the idea intoxicated him. I would have thought it would take him much longer to give up on that plan. He wanted it too much. But there was also the thought of you, Carlyle, of our family growing stronger and larger. The jealousy and the fear. You having not more than he had, but still things that he wanted. He tried not to think about it, but he couldn't hide it completely. The idea of rooting out the competition was there. Besides their own, ours is the largest coven they've ever found. I stared at his face in horror. He'd never told me this, but I guessed I knew why. I could see it in my head now. Aro's dream. Edward and Alice in black flowing robes, drifting along at Aro's side with their eyes cold and blood red. Carlyle interrupted my waking nightmare. They're too committed to their mission. They would never break the rules themselves. Goes against everything they've worked for. They'll clean up afterward. A double betrayal, Edward said in a grim voice. No harm done. Jasper leaned forward, shaking his head. No, Carlyle's right. The Volturi do not break rules. Besides, it's much too sloppy. This person, this threat, they have no idea what they're doing. A first-timer, I'd swear to it. I cannot believe the Volturi are involved, but they will be. They all stared at each other, frozen with stress. Then let's go, Emmett almost roared. What are we waiting for? Carlyle and Edward exchanged a long glance. Edward nodded once. We'll need you to teach us, Jasper, Carlyle finally said. How to destroy them. Carlyle's jaw was hard, but I could see the pain in his eyes as he said the words. No one hated violence more than Carlyle. There was something bothering me, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I was numb, horrified, deathly afraid, and yet under that I could feel that I was missing something important. Something that would make sense out of the chaos, that would explain it. We're going to need help, Jasper said. Do you think Tanya's family would be willing? Another 5 mature vampires would make an enormous difference. And then Kate and Eliza would be especially advantageous on our side. It would be almost easy with their aid. We'll ask, Carlyle answered. Jasper held out a cell phone. We need to hurry. I'd never seen Carlyle's innate calm so shaken. He took the phone and paced toward the windows. He dialed a number, held the phone to his ear, and laid the other hand against the glass. He stared out into the foggy morning with a pained and ambivalent expression. Edward took my hand and pulled me to the white love seat. I sat beside him, staring at his face while he stared at Carlyle. Carlyle's voice was low and quick, difficult to hear. I heard him greet Tanya, and then he raced through the situation too fast for me to understand much, though I could tell that the Alaskan vampires were not ignorant of what was going on in Seattle. Then something changed in Carlyle's voice. "Oh," he said, his voice sharper in surprise. "We didn't realize that Irina felt that way." Edward groaned at my side and closed his eyes. "Damn it. Damn Laurent to the deepest pit of hell where he belongs." "Laurent," I whispered, the blood emptying from my face, but Edward didn't respond, focused on Carlyle's thoughts. My short encounter with Laurent early this spring was not something that had faded or dimmed in my mind. I still remembered every word he'd said before Jacob and his pack had interrupted. I actually came here as a favor to her. Victoria. Laurent had been her first maneuver. She'd sent him to observe, to see how hard it might be to get to me. He hadn't survived the wolves to report back. Though he'd kept up his old ties with Victoria after James's death, he'd also formed new ties and new relationships. He'd gone to live with Tanya's family in Alaska. Tanya, the strawberry blonde, the closest friends the Cullens had in the vampire world. Practically extended family. Laurent had been with them for almost a year previous to his death. Carlyle was still talking, his voice not quite pleading. Persuasive, but with an edge. Then the edge abruptly won out over the persuasion. "There's no question of that," Carlyle said in a stern voice. "We have a truce. They haven't broken it, and neither will we." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Of course. We'll just have to do our best alone." Carlyle shut the phone without waiting for an answer. He continued to stare out into the fog. "What's the problem?" Emmett murmured to Edward. "Irina was more involved with our friend Laurent than we knew. She's holding a grudge against the wolves for destroying him to save Bella. She wants..." He paused, looking down at me. "Go on," I said as evenly as I could. His eyes tightened. "She wants revenge, to take down the pack. They would trade their help for our permission." "No," I gasped. "Don't worry," he told me in a flat voice. "Carlyle would never agree to it." He hesitated, then sighed. "Nor would I. Laurent had it coming. This was almost a growl. And I still owe the wolves for that." "This isn't good," Jasper said. "It's too even a fight. We'd have the upper hand in skill, but not numbers. We'd win, but at what price?" His tense eyes flashed to Alice's face in a way. I wanted to scream out loud as I grasped what Jasper meant. We would win, but we would lose. Some wouldn't survive. I looked around the room at their faces. Jasper, Alice, Emmett, Rose, Esme, Carlyle, Edward. The faces of my family. "You can't be serious," I said Wednesday afternoon. "You've completely lost your mind." "Say whatever you like about me," Alice answered. "The party is still on." I stared at her, my eyes so wide with disbelief it felt like they might fall out and land on my lunch tray. "Oh, calm down, Bella. There's no reason not to go through with it. Besides, the invitations are already sent." Insane, I spluttered. You've already bought my present, she reminded me. You don't have to do anything but show up. I made an effort to calm myself. With everything that's going on right now, a party's hardly appropriate. Graduation is what's going on right now, and a party is so appropriate that it's almost passé. Alice, she sighed and tried to be serious. There are a few things we need to get in order now, and that's going to take a little time. As long as we're sitting here waiting, we might as well commemorate the good stuff. You're only going to graduate from high school for the first time once. You don't get to be human again, Bella. This is a once-in-a-lifetime shot. Edward, silent through our little argument, flashed her a warning look. She stuck out her tongue at him. She was right. Her soft voice would never carry over the babble of the cafeteria. No one would understand the meaning behind her words in any case. What few things do we need to get in order? I asked, refusing to be sidetracked. Edward answered in a low voice. Jasper thinks we could use some help. Tanya's family isn't the only choice we have. Carlisle's trying to track down a few old friends, and Jasper's looking up Peter and Charlotte. He's considering talking to Maria, but no one really wants to involve the Southerners. Alice shuddered delicately. It shouldn't be too hard to convince them to help, he continued. Nobody wants a visit from Italy. But these friends, they're not going to be vegetarians, right? I protested, using the Cullens' tongue-in-cheek nickname for themselves. No, Edward answered, suddenly expressionless. Here? In Forks? They're friends, Alice reassured me. Everything's going to be fine. Don't worry. And then Jasper has to teach us a few courses on newborn elimination. Edward's eyes brightened at that, and a brief smile flashed across his face. My stomach suddenly felt like it was full of sharp little splinters of ice. When are you going? I asked in a hollow voice. I couldn't stand this. The idea that someone might not come back. What if it was Emmett, so brave and thoughtless that he was never the least bit cautious? Or Esme, so sweet and motherly that I couldn't even imagine her in a fight? Or Alice, so tiny, so fragile looking, or... But I couldn't even think the name. Consider the possibility. A week, Edward said casually. That ought to give us enough time. The icy splinters twisted uncomfortably in my stomach. I was suddenly nauseated. You look kind of green, Bella, Alice commented. Edward put his arm around me and pulled me tightly against his side. It's going to be fine, Bella. Trust me. Sure, I thought to myself. Trust him. He wasn't the one who was going to have to sit behind and wonder whether or not the core of his existence was going to come home. And then it occurred to me. Maybe I didn't need to sit behind. A week was more than enough time. You're looking for help, I said slowly. Yes, Alice's head cocked to the side as she processed the change in my tone. I looked only at her as I answered. My voice was just slightly louder than a whisper. I could help. Edward's body was suddenly rigid, his arm too tight around me. He exhaled and the sound was a hiss. But it was Alice, still calm, who answered. That really wouldn't be helpful. Why not? I argued. I could hear the desperation in my voice. 8 is better than 7. There's more than enough time. There's not enough time to make you helpful, Bella, she disagreed coolly. Do you remember how Jasper described the young ones? You'd be no good in a fight. You wouldn't be able to control your instincts, and that would make you an easy target. And then Edward would get hurt trying to protect you. She folded her arms across her chest, pleased with her unassailable logic. And I knew she was right. When she put it like that, I slumped in my seat, my sudden hope defeated. Beside me, Edward relaxed. He whispered the reminder in my ear. Not because you're afraid. Oh, Alice said, and a blank look crossed her face. Then her expression became surly. I hate last-minute cancellations, so that puts the party attendance list down to 65. 65? My eyes bulged again. I didn't have that many friends. Did I even know that many people? Who cancelled? Edward wondered, ignoring me. Renee. What? I gasped. She was going to surprise you for your graduation, but something went wrong. You'll have a message when you get home. For a moment, I just let myself enjoy the relief. Whatever it was that went wrong for my mother, I was eternally grateful to it. If she had come to Forks now, I didn't want to think about it. My head would explode. The message light was flashing when I got home. My feeling of relief flared again as I listened to my mother describe Phil's accident on the ball field. While demonstrating a slide, he had tangled up with the catcher and broken his thigh bone. He was entirely dependent on her, and there was no way she could leave him. My mum was still apologizing when the message cut off. Well, that's one, I sighed. One what? Edward asked. One person I don't have to worry about getting killed this week. He rolled his eyes. Why won't you and Alice take this seriously? I demanded. This is serious. He smiled. Confidence. Wonderful, I grumbled. I picked up the phone and dialed Renee's number. I knew it would be a long conversation, but I also knew I wouldn't have to contribute much. I just listened and reassured her every time I could get a word in. I wasn't disappointed, I wasn't mad, I wasn't hurt. She should concentrate on helping Phil get better. I passed on my get well soon to Phil and promised to call her with every single detail from Forks High's generic graduation. Finally, I had to use my desperate need to study for finals to get off the phone. Edward's patience was endless. He waited politely through the whole conversation, just playing with my hair and smiling whenever I looked up. It was probably superficial to notice such things while I had so many more important things to think about, but his smile still knocked the breath out of me. He was so beautiful that it made it hard sometimes to think about anything else. Hard to concentrate on Phil's troubles or Renee's apologies or hostile vampire armies. I was only human. As soon as I hung up, I stretched onto my tiptoes to kiss him. He put his hands around my waist and lifted me onto the kitchen counter so I wouldn't have to reach as far. That worked for me. I locked my arms around his neck and melted against his cold chest. Too soon, as usual, he pulled away. I felt my face slip into a pout. He laughed at my expression as he extricated himself from my arms and legs. He leaned against the counter next to me and put one arm lightly around my shoulders. I know that you think I have some kind of perfect, unyielding self-control, but that's not actually the case. I wish, I sighed. And he sighed too. After school tomorrow, he said, changing the subject. I'm going hunting with Carlisle, Esme, and Rosalie. Just for a few hours. We'll stay close. Alice, Jasper, and Emmett should be able to keep you safe. Ugh, I grumbled. Tomorrow was the first day of finals, and it was only a half day. I had calculus and history, the only two challenges in my lineup, so I'd have almost the whole day without him and nothing to do but worry. I hate being babysat. It's temporary, he promised. Jasper will be bored. Emmett will make fun of me. They'll be on their best behavior. Right, I grumbled. And then it occurred to me, I did have one option besides babysitters. You know, I haven't been to La Push since the bonfire. I watched his face carefully for any change in expression. His eyes tightened the tiniest bit. I'd be safe enough there, I reminded him. He thought about it for a few seconds. You're probably right. His face was calm, but just a little too smooth. I almost asked if he'd rather I stayed here, but then I thought of the ribbing Emmett would no doubt dish out, and I changed the subject. Are you thirsty already? I asked, reaching up to stroke the light shadow beneath his eye. His irises were still a deep gold. Not really. He seemed reluctant to answer, and that surprised me. I waited for an explanation. We want to be as strong as possible, he explained, still reluctant. We'll probably hunt again on the way, looking for big game. That makes you stronger? He searched my face for something, but there was nothing to find but curiosity. Yes, he finally said. Human blood makes us the strongest, though only fractionally. Jasper's been thinking about cheating. Averse as he is to the idea, he's nothing if not practical. But he won't suggest it. He knows what Carlyle will say. Would that help? I asked quietly. Doesn't matter. We aren't going to change who we are. I frowned. If something helped even the odds. And then I shuddered, realizing I was willing to have a stranger die to protect him. I was horrified at myself, but not entirely able to deny it either. He changed the subject again. That's why they're so strong, of course. The newborns are full of human blood, their own blood, reacting to the change. It lingers in the tissues and strengthens them. Their bodies use it up slowly. Like Jasper said, the strength starting to wane after about a year. How strong will I be? He grinned. Stronger than I am. Stronger than Emmett? The grin got bigger. Yes. Do me a favor and challenge him to an arm wrestling match. It would be a good experience for him. I laughed. It sounded so ridiculous. Then I sighed and hopped down from the counter because I really couldn't put it off any longer. I had to cram, and cram hard. Luckily, I had Edward's help, and Edward was an excellent tutor, since he knew absolutely everything. I figured my biggest problem would be just focusing on the tests. If I didn't watch myself, I might end up writing my history essay on the vampire wars of the South. And that is where we close the book tonight on this episode of Down to Sleep. Until then, thank you for being here, thank you for the support, and good night.